Y a-t-il une élite de l'ombre qui tire doucement les ficelles de notre monde pour la réalisation de son programme politique? Les réponses à ces questions pourraient vous surprendre.
And Ezra Pound himself was never named for the Nobel Prize, although 4 of his pupils were, simply because he never cultivated the establishment. He never, well, in the 1930s and 1940s, you really had to be a very active, outspoken pro-communist to get anywhere. So, of course, he was totally ignored by everybody, except the public. The public liked his work. And his novels were all bestsellers. They made a movie of For Whom the Bell Tolls. That's the most famous book, but he actually wrote some others that were quite good. So Ezra had these 4 proteges who had got the Nobel Prize when I met him, and he really jumped on me and started whipping me into shape. And he assigned me to go to the Library of Congress and see what I could find out about the Federal Reserve System. Well, I really had a knack for research, and I found out the entire history of the Federal Reserve System, which is the greatest swindle ever known in history, where a group of private bankers conspired criminally to take over the money and credit of the United States, which they did in 1913, and they passed the Federal Reserve Plan through the Democratic Party in Washington, D.C., and it became a law of Congress. And this law handed over to this private bank all of the money and credit of the United States, which was a pretty good day's work. And they've kept it ever since, because they set it up as a monopoly so that the stock of the Federal Reserve banks could never be traded publicly. It could only be handed down in a family, or if a corporation bought the bank that owned it, they became possessors of the stock. You've never been able to buy, since 1914, you've not been able to buy a share of Federal Reserve Bank stock on the market anywhere. And that is monopoly. That's what they have. It's a monopoly. You see, they're totally insulated against anyone buying control of the Federal Reserve System. And John D. Rockefeller was one of the biggest holders, and he had his stock placed under the Rockefeller Foundation, so it can never be bought or sold. So it's secure forever. And the other people who bought control in 1914, they were the Schiff family and the Warburg family, and of course they still have their own family fortunes, and they have a controlling interest in Federal Reserve Bank stock, in various Federal Reserve banks. It's not all in one Federal Reserve Bank, it's in a number of Federal Reserve banks. And I think most of the holders of Federal Reserve Bank have at least stock in at least 5 of the Federal Reserve banks.
What are the consequences of having the Federal Reserve control the monetary system of the United States?
Well, the consequences are very important, and they're never discussed by any economist in the United States. The Federal Reserve Bank is a central bank. And a central bank, this is not taught in any economics class in the United States or in the world. A central bank is a bank of issue, which has the right to print all the money it wants. That's what a bank of issue means. You can print all the money you want. There's no control over it whatsoever. And right now the Federal Reserve Bank is printing trillions of dollars, which are almost worthless, and they're looking for hyperinflation actually, because it'll be a repeat of 1924 in Germany. But I think they've taken some precautions. It probably won't happen, because they've been through all that. They know exactly what will happen. And in hyperinflation, the money becomes worthless to the point where you have to have a wheelbarrow full of currency, paper currency, to buy a loaf of bread, which is normally worth 18 cents at that time. So they don't want to go through that again, so they're taking care of that. But the Federal Reserve has printed so much of this paper fiat currency, debt money, that it's overloaded the world. China and Japan have trillions of dollars of our so-called national debt, which is our currency. And of course they know that when it goes, it goes. When a currency becomes worthless, nothing's more worthless than a currency that becomes worthless. So they're staving off the inevitable by hedging and doing what they can. But once you buy this debt, this paper dollar currency, you're stuck with it unless you can find another sucker to take it off your hands. and there's nobody right now who wants any part of it. So China and Japan are stuck with it, and they bought this currency to maintain trade with the United States. That's all it was for. So in effect, we're financing our trade with China, trade with Japan by our Federal Reserve currency, which is neither federal, it's not federal any more than the Federal Express Company is a federal company. And it has no reserves because it doesn't need any reserves because it prints its own currency. If you can print your own money, what do you need of reserves? You just go and warm up the printing press and turn out another $10 billion. So, and finally, it's not a system. It's called the Federal Reserve System. It's not federal, it has no reserves, and it's not a system, but I'm the only person in the world who's ever defined it in my works as a criminal syndicate. And that's what it is. It's a criminal syndicate, just like the mafia, which is one of its subsidiaries, and the CIA and all of the criminal syndicates work out of the Federal Reserve System, because that's what a Federal Reserve System is. A central bank is a group of bankers which have total control of a nation's economy. And they print their own money, print as much as they want to, and it eventually becomes worthless and through speculation. See, a central bank is set up for speculation. The Federal Reserve System was set up solely for speculation, and its author, Paul Warburg, who was a partner of Kuhn Loeb Company in New York, which, by the way, financed the Communist Revolution, financed the Hitler Revolution, and financed the Japanese entry into World War II. So I defined in my work that a central bank's principal role is for war finance, because war finance is the most profitable enterprise you can get into. And so if you're a banker, you're looking for the best investment you can make, which is a war. For instance, the Iraq War. Now, when they set up the Iraq War, Halliburton and Company, which is the oil production company, or an oil equipment company actually, but it finances the big oil explorations. And they found out that, oil companies found out that a war is the most profitable investment you can have. During World War I, Rockefeller, out of his patriotic goodwill, upped the price of oil 5 times to the U.S. government. That's how we won the war. And that's how he became, he was already the richest man in the world. And the richest man in the world wants to become the richest man in the universe, which is your next step, and apparently he made that. So that's what it comes. People wonder why a billionaire wants more money. Now, H.L. Hunt's sons, 4 sons, each one of them started off life at 21 with $1 billion at that time. And as you can imagine, they haven't thrown it away. So they were, on paper, they're worth about $2 billion apiece at the present time. But who knows what their holdings are.
How was the Federal Reserve set up?
Well, it was set up as 12 districts. See, we had 48 states in the United States at that time. So you would think that the logical way would be to set up a Federal Reserve Bank in each state and have the 48 Federal Reserve banks. But instead, they carved the United States into 12 districts of their own, which they called Federal Reserve districts. And these 12 Federal Reserve districts are actually the government of the United States. They override the states and they override the federal government. And not many people know that. They don't know that this is the Federal Reserve System of the United States, the Federal Reserve districts.
Why didn't the American people rise up or say something about it?
They didn't say anything about it because it was a hidden conspiracy. Now I'm always called a conspiratologist, and people say I see conspiracies everywhere. But as I told a reporter for the Dallas Morning News a couple years ago in a front page story, I said I've never had to invent a conspiracy in my life. There are more conspiracies than I can possibly write about. So it's not a question of seeing conspiracies under every bed. It's a question of seeing conspiracies in every commercial activity and every political activity that goes on in this country. Because they always have a hidden agenda, which means that the conspirators have to keep their identities concealed, and it's always criminal in nature because they always have some criminal objective to obtain by operating this conspiracy. That makes it all persons involved in a conspiracy for a criminal purpose automatically become criminals, criminally liable. And that is the case of everybody who has anything to do with the Federal Reserve System. They're criminally liable for participating in a criminal conspiracy. And there's no other definition that you can make because under law, a person who is involved in a criminal conspiracy is a criminal. And that's the upshot of the whole thing. There's nothing more to be said.
Why doesn't Congress control the money?
Well, Thomas Jefferson and the writers of the Constitution specifically designated the Congress to control the money. And they designated that the monetary unit of the United States would be gold and silver. There is no specification anywhere in the Constitution for paper money. And what the Federal Reserve conspiracy of 1913 did, it made lawful a paper currency which the Constitution did not authorize. But they passed it through Congress, so it became public law of Congress, and that made it official that the Federal Reserve dollar became the monetary unit of the United States as paper currency, which totally defied the Constitution, which provided that only gold and silver could be the monetary unit of the United States, and that only Congress would control the monetary unit of the United States. So it was doubly unconstitutional at its outset. It's become more unconstitutional every day since.
Is there any gold left in Fort Knox?
No one knows. I worked with a man named Edward Durrell who spent quite a fortune of his own, probably $100 million, trying to prove that there was no gold in Fort Knox. And apparently he finally I was able to prove it, but they never published the fact that it's not there. And they had a number of congressmen go to Fort Knox, and they led them deep into the bowels of the earth, about 50 floors down in elevators. And there they were shown, through iron cages, they were shown some stacks of what were supposed to be gold bars. And they said, that's the gold stock of the United States. But the congressmen were not allowed to go past the gold bars, the bars of the gold bars, and they were not allowed to, I think they finally extricated one gold bar and handed it to them, and they more or less could see there was gold, which you could not determine except by a chemical assay. And so a congressman was handed a gold bar, and he agreed this is the entire gold stock of the United States. And that is the only acknowledgement that we have gold in Fort Knox.
What is the difference between a gold or silver-backed currency as opposed to a fiat currency?
Well, fiat currency is paper currency, which is backed by paper money, which is what the Federal Reserve dollar is. And I say in my book that Congress in 1944, during World War II, when the American people were occupied with the war and so forth, Congress in 1944 hurriedly passed a law removing the last gold and silver from the backing of the U.S. dollar. So since 1944, the U.S. dollar has been a paper-backed money issued against paper bonds. It's paper on paper. So that's the status today. The United States dollar is more or less the trading currency of the entire world, and it's totally worthless. Has no backing of any kind.
What's wrong with paper or money?
Well, you can take a Federal Reserve dollar bill and go to any store in the United States and buy $1 worth of goods. And so it's worth $1. It's accepted as $1. But it's accepted, credit means I believe. So that means that any merchant who accepts a Federal Reserve dollar says, I believe that this is a real dollar. So that's all there is to it. It's still a piece of green paper, which is worth what any green paper is. You can figure yourself. You can take a sheet of green paper and you can clip out $800, $100 bills.
So monopoly money is
Monopoly money. It's the same as the game Monopoly.
What's wrong with central banks?
You have to understand that all the settlers who came to America, including my ancestor William Mullins, were fleeing European oppression. And this oppression was primarily government officials working for private banks who were oppressing the people, charging them too much interest or usury, and taking their homes and property because they didn't have enough cash to pay off the debt. And so people finally fed up and set sail for the United States to get away from this. So of course every settler who came to the United States was totally against banks because they were running away from banks. That's why they came here. So obviously they did not welcome the idea of setting up banks on U.S. soil. They were firmly opposed to it. And Charles Lindbergh capitalized on that sentiment of the American people when he led the fight in Congress against the Federal Reserve System in 1913. And his son, Charles Lindbergh Jr., became a very famous aviator and a world figure. And his entire public career, he never mentioned the Federal Reserve, which his father gave up his political career for. So he was run out of Congress because he voted against the Federal Reserve System. Every congressman who voted against the Federal Reserve System in 1913 was run out of Congress the following year. New York banks sent in somebody to run against him, and they were lavishly financed with printing press money, and they put him right out of office. And there's never been, since 1914, anyone in Congress, except one or two isolated instances, we've never had anyone in Washington who would criticize the Federal Reserve System. Just as on television, you never have a radio program which will criticize the Federal Reserve System. Of course, you have three competing networks there who are ostensibly economic rivals and very dedicated rivals, and yet they totally agree on everything like the Federal Reserve System and foreign policy and so forth. We've got to defeat Hitler, and we've got to defeat communism. We've got to defeat Nazism. Well, if you ask the average man in the street in the 1940s if he wants to defeat communism, he says yes, because his newspapers and his politicians tell him we've got to defeat communism. At the very time of the Cold War with communism, the United States taxpayer was totally financing the Soviet Union, which had been insolvent since 1917 and which had been maintained by the United States taxpayer ever since. And Woodrow Wilson, who was born about 3 blocks from where we're sitting, initiated this system of financing the Soviet Union in 1917. When he voted, Congress voted him a special emergency war fund of $100 million, which at that time was the same as about $1 trillion at that time, to prosecute the war against Germany. And he took $10 million of that, 1/10 of it, and sent it to Russia to help the Bolsheviks in Russia. And there were no Bolsheviks in the United States Congress. So why did the U.S. Congress authorize him to send them $10 million? Well, they've been doing it ever since. It's only been...
What is that reason?
Because bankers consider communism and dictatorship as a good investment. A banker considers a dictatorship as a perfect government because everybody is totally controlled, and if anybody objects to paying high taxes or to paying debts, you can put them in a concentration camp or execute them, which Stalin did in Russia, and which is the perfect system. No banker will ever tell you this. Well, David Rockefeller did during the 1940s. He said the reason he was so pro-communist at that time was because the communists collected their debts at the point of a gun, which he didn't say, but that's why they do it. And that is why dictatorship remains the ideal of all bankers.
What is the main mission of the Federal Reserve System today?
Well, my book, The World Order, goes into that quite extensively, which unfortunately is out of print. But I found out when I wrote that book that the main mission of the banks was to start wars. And I found out also that it's very difficult to start a war. If you want to start a war with Iraq, go out and try to do it. It's very tough. And it takes years of hard work. So Bush had a great advantage because his father was head of the Central Intelligence Agency and a worldwide drug distribution operation. So he had plenty of money and plenty of political influence. He had no problem at all to walk into Iraq, although Iraq had never fired a shot at the United States. You see, you declare war on another country when they invade your country and try to take your territory, or there has to be some very good reason to have a war, because you can understand that it's very difficult to get millions of people to run out and kill each other when they have absolutely no bone of contention whatsoever. In fact, all the wars have had... See, that's why Ezra got into this entire thing, and that's how he got me into it. He was living in Paris during World War I, and he had many young writers and artist friends who were drafted into the armies, and some were for Germany and some were for France, and they were killed. And he couldn't understand how these great talents, very brilliant young men, died for nothing. And when he spent years of studying the situation in 8 languages all over Europe, he found out that bankers make wars to create debt. And that's the only reason. And that's the only reason. We went to war against Germany in World War I and World War II at a time when by census, 52% of the population of the United States was of German origin. So this was like a civil war. The bankers, the central banks of Europe, and they couldn't have World War I. They'd been wanting World War I since 1885. But the central banks of Europe had already bankrupted every country in Europe. And it was impossible to have a war. They didn't have enough money. There wasn't a country in Europe, England, France, Germany, Russia. There wasn't a country in Europe which could finance one day's war anywhere. So that's why they were conspiring in the United States to get the Federal Reserve System passed, because the Federal Reserve System was conjured up simply to make World War I possible. Without the Federal Reserve, there would never have been a World War I. No American would ever have died in World War I. So you can say they were murdered by the bankers, because that was the only reason they were there.
So you say that they don't start the war, but they conspire to make it happen? I mean,
they make it happen, yes.
How do they do that? I mean,
well, they do that through worldwide conspiracies, through Masonic and other secret brotherhoods all over the world, which operate as criminal conspiracies. The Mafia, the Masons, and the Jesuits, and so forth. There are always these underground groups which are very profitable. When you get into one of those things, you get into very profitable situations. And when you're in one of these organizations, you become very wealthy yourself. Al Capone became one of the richest people in the United States. And he complained to the newspaper men. He said, "I'm just like any other businessman." And he was. All businessmen were like him, but they wouldn't admit it.
Is the United States government a corporate banking criminal enterprise?
Well, it's a conglomerate of various criminal enterprises. There are many criminal enterprises in the United States. Some are quite large and some are quite small.
is the government a criminal enterprise?
Always a criminal enterprise. Because the elections are completely staged and manipulated from the beginning to the end. The candidates are chosen through a very careful process of someone who will thoroughly agree with anything they want to do, foreign policy and economic policy. There are two ways you govern a country, and that's through economic policy and foreign policy. Because as far as a country itself, it's a limited operation. The United States is limited to the borders of this country.
Is the U.S. monetary system controlled by the Bank of England?
Oh, yes, it is. I say that in my book. The subtitle of my book, Secrets of the Federal Reserve, is The London Connection, in which I prove conclusively that London still runs the United States. See, London is still the world market of the world bankers. Not Washington, not New York, and not Tokyo, and not Berlin, but it's London. George Bush went public after I published this book. It had been published for about almost a year, and I'd sold maybe 100 copies because I never advertised my books. They were never reviewed. Nobody paid attention to it. And George Bush Sr. was president at that time, and in November of whatever year it was, he started going on the television and talking about the New World Order. And of course, the only book on the World Order is my book. So I sold out immediately, which was very disconcerting because I have no publishing company, and I had to go and print another edition. And so it's out of print again right now. But people are begging for copies. In fact, they sell copies on the internet for very large sums because it's the only book.
What is the World Order? The
World Order is a conglomeration of people who agree on the same goals, and they run the world.
So it's a conspiracy of
bankers and politicians and political leaders, and it's mostly it's what is loosely known as capitalists. And a capitalist is not a person who makes capital, he's a person who has capital, and he can make investments. That's what a capitalist is. And he makes investments that make money, more money, and that's all capitalism is. You invest in things that make more money than you have already. So when H.L. Hunt was the richest man in the world, he was buying whole radio networks. In fact, I helped him set up a television network, and he was going to have his own television network. At that time, there were still 3 networks, and he was going to set up a 4th because he had so much money that there was no problem for him at all to set up a television network. And it's a good thing for him he didn't do it because he would have been murdered if he had started his own television network. He wouldn't have lived 6 months because that is real power. They didn't care how much money he made, that he was the richest man in the world, but it's when you take over the levers of power that you become dangerous. And when he had his own television network, he could have ruled the whole world. So he would have been killed, there's no question about it.
Why is it that people don't seem to care?
Well, in the 1930s, scientists wondered how Hitler could rule Germany and Stalin could rule Russia. These were vast territories. He could rule with practically no army. And the answer was they had discovered during the 1920s that adding sodium fluoride to the drinking water made the people very passive. Stalin found out that in his concentration camps, where you have to have guards, I mean nobody's there because they want to be, that by adding sodium fluoride to the drinking water to camps, or the gulags, he could reduce his guards by an average of 4. You only need 1 in 4, 25% instead of 100%, which comes to quite a bit of money. Sodium fluoride is a byproduct of the manufacture of aluminum, which is a very complicated, well, you have it in Florida. It's a very complicated manufacturing process, and a byproduct of the manufacture of aluminum is sodium fluoride, which is a very dangerous chemical and is very expensive to dispose of. So somebody came up with the imaginative premise that maybe sodium fluoride could be used to add to water, and maybe it would help prevent cavities in children in their teeth. There was never any study conducted on this, and no proof whatsoever that this was true, but Congress, with a judicious application of bribes, passed a bill enacting sodium fluoride addition to water supplies all over the United States. And we haven't had a revolution since. And we had one-party government ever since.
Why did America get involved in World War II?
Well, it was inevitable because World War II was simply a rerun of World War I, exactly the same cast of characters. And in fact, it was the same person, Colonel Mandel House, whose father was a Rothschild agent during the Civil War. And the senior House managed to have runners, privateers, bring cotton from the South to the British mills so that they could operate during the Civil War. So he made a lot of money, of course. And at the end of the Civil War, Colonel House was the only person in the state of Texas who had any money. So he took over the entire Democratic Party in the southern states, which were occupied territory, and still are. You still have two political parties in the South. They're called the carpetbaggers and the scalawags. The carpetbaggers are the Republicans, and the scalawags are the Democrats. And you have exactly the same government that you have had in martial law in 1865, with the same people running everything. It's a perfect setup because everybody knows each other, everybody agrees with each other. There hasn't been a political contest in any southern state since 1865.
Is there a difference between carpetbaggers and scallywags?
Well, there is a difference. The difference is in the name. One group calls themselves Republicans, and the other calls Democrats. The Republicans are not Republicans, and the Democrats are not Democrats. As I say, they're carpetbaggers and scalawags, but they're not known. The press doesn't use those terms because it's offensive to some people. Some people would be offended by that.
Was the United States ever really a true republic?
I don't know that we were. I really do not. Because the people who rewrote we started off with the Articles of Confederation. See, that's where the Confederacy comes from. Because when the southern states seceded from the Union, they were exercising the prerogative which they had been given during the Articles of Confederation to secede at any time. You see, the Articles of Confederation gave every state complete autonomy over its own power, over its own people. And so the southern states in 1860 decided to secede from the Union, which they had a perfect right to do. But in 1787, they rewrote the Articles of Confederation, and it was actually a secret convention of Masons in Philadelphia, and they rewrote the Constitution to create a federal government, mainly for the borrowing power. The bankers wanted a country which could have a borrowing power and which could pay back the money. And that was not possible under the Articles of Confederation. The United States colonies, when they won the American Revolution, they set up a governing document called the Articles of Confederation of the United States of America. And that was our sole constitution. But then these Masons got together in 1787 and said, we need a instrument of federal power, and we need an instrument able to borrow money and repay it. And that's why they rewrote the Articles of Confederation, and that's why they did it in secret, because they didn't dare tell anybody that that's what they wanted to do, to set up a dictatorial federal power, which the Supreme Court was invented to maintain federal power. The Supreme Court always says that the rule of law is the United States. Well, the rule of law is simply the rule of bandits who will control the United States. That is the rule of law. And if you violate that law, you'll be killed.
Where are the Articles of Confederation located?
No, the Articles of Confederation, I have never seen a copy of it. It's hidden somewhere if any copies exist.
Who wrote the federal government has no power over any citizen of the United States?
That's for me. I'm the only one who said that.
What is that? Where did that come from?
Well, that's the Betrayal of the Constitution. That's my latest book, the last book I wrote. And I simply said in there that the general welfare of the United States, the Supreme Court passed his Social Security bill and all of his other bills under false premise that the general welfare of the United States provides for this. Well, what it actually says is that the government shall provide for the general welfare of the United States, which upheld the original Articles of Confederation, which said that each state has complete autonomy. And therefore, the bill for the general welfare of the United States is the bill upholding the Articles of Confederation. But they perverted that the Constitution says that you have to uphold the general welfare of the states, which is what it says. And all of the government programs for citizens are totally illegal because only a state has the power over a citizen. The Washington government has no power. The Washington government is in the seat of government, which is Washington, D.C., and it only has authority in the 24 square miles of the District of Columbia and has no power on any state in the United States. That is why Governor George Wallace of Alabama threatened to arrest FBI agents who were creating revolution in the state of Alabama, which he had every legal right to do as a governor of the state of Alabama, because Washington had no power to send an FBI agent into the state of Alabama without Governor George Wallace's permission, which they didn't have.
Is the dictatorship of the federal government the reason George W. Bush is in office today?
Oh, yes. That was simply a plebiscite, actually, just like Hitler had in Germany in 19... In fact, the Bush family has very deep ties to Nazi Germany. Oh, yes. Well, in fact, the United States government in Washington has carried out many of Hitler's policies, which he was unable to do because he didn't rule long enough. He had on his plans to bomb the nation of Yugoslavia before he attacked Russia, because he knew that he had to knock off the Slavic population in Yugoslavia before he would be able to attack Russia. And so he launched an attack against Yugoslavia, and time ran out on him on June the 4th, 1944, when he attacked, on June 42 it may have been, when he attacked Russia. He had to attack then, although he had not yet subdued Yugoslavia. And so a loyal Nazi named President Bill Clinton finally carried out Hitler's plan of attacking Yugoslavia, and he bombed it into oblivion. That was carrying out the original Nazi program, because certainly the people of Arkansas, where Clinton was from, had no interest in bombing Yugoslavia. And I could give you many parallels of government action in the last 25 years, which is carrying out the policies of Adolf Hitler.
Who financed Hitler's war?
A good friend of mine, Tony Sutton, wrote a book called Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, and he wrote a second book called Wall Street and the Rise of Bolshevism, which are out of print now. Tony's dead. But the books are absolutely authentic, and he absolutely proves that every step of Nazism was financed by Wall Street bankers, and every step of communism was financed by Wall Street bankers.
And the Wall Street bankers are tied into international moneylenders?
Well, they're tied into the consortium of central bankers of the entire world. The Bank of Italy, the Bank of Japan. And so, well, these are people who've learned to work together, so they do very well.
How was the Bush family tied into World War II?
Well, I always have to start my lectures on Bush by pointing out that the Bush family itself has no background at all. The Bush family was had worked for the Harriman family, and Jacob Schiff at Kuhn Loeb Company, which I mentioned earlier, he financed John D. Rockefeller in the Standard Oil in New Jersey, which became the world oil monopoly, and he financed the Harriman brothers in the Northern Pacific Railroad, which developed the whole western half of the United States with tremendous property rights along the right-of-way of that railroad, which made it probably the richest corporation in the country. And so the Harrimans, of course, made billions of dollars, and they, as really wealthy people did, they had to have somebody to handle their money. So they hired a young couple, a young family, the Bush family, who were Wall Street operators. They became their money managers. And that's all they did was manage money for the Harriman family. And so, by the way, Averell Harriman became a world agent for the bankers, and his exploits were memorialized in a series of books by Sinclair Lewis, who was a very popular novelist in the 1930s, about a invented character. He called him Lanny Budd, and this was a very wealthy young man who traveled around the world on a first-hand knowledge of world leaders. He was welcomed into their offices and directed policy for them. And Averell Harriman actually wound up, from 1942 to 1944, Stalin had a nervous breakdown when Hitler invaded Germany, and they had to send Averell Harriman as the world agent of the world bankers to Moscow ostensibly as U.S. ambassador, and he went into Russia and was the actual dictator of Russia from 1942 to 1944, because Stalin was totally immobilized by his nervous breakdown. And so the whole World War II would have collapsed if Averell Harriman hadn't gone in and kept it going by running Russia from behind the scenes. And of course, at that time, Russia was fighting Nazi Germany. So theoretically, Averell Harriman and the United States were Nazi Germany's biggest enemies. And finally, the Russian army didn't sweep through Germany and conquer Hitler, but that was done through Averell Harriman. There was nothing that Stalin accomplished whatsoever, but nobody knows that. But this is the connection of the Harrimans with Hitler. They actually defeated Hitler, but what they did, they laid Germany waste and it became an American colony, or colony of the world bankers, and has been occupied territory ever since. Both Germany and Italy, Germany and Japan, have been totally occupied countries since 1945.
Can you talk about your book, The $5 Trillion Cold War Hoax?
Well, the $5 trillion Cold War hoax was exposed by Norman Podhoretz, who's one of the big Zionist propagandists in the United States. He was the editor of Commentary in New York City of the American Jewish Committee, which was the unofficial Bible of world Zionism. Commentary carried very serious articles by respected writers on economic and political things. It was like the Foreign Relations, Council on Foreign Relations publication, Foreign Affairs. These were the Bibles of people in the State Department and in Congress to read it. They had to read these articles to know what was to do. And that's how they got their instructions. And so anyway, Norman Podhoretz published his autobiography a few years after the Cold War, and he stated in his autobiography, which was for the elite, of course, the average person would never read it, he stated quite frankly that the only purpose of the Cold War was to arm Israel to fight the Arab nations. We're in Iraq today because Podhoretz armed Israel in the 1940s, 50s. See, all this came out of the Paris Peace Conference at Versailles in 1919. There's a book called 1919, Paris and Versailles. And that's a very important book. It tells you everything that was done at the Versailles Peace Conference. And one of the main things was a very vigorous Zionist conference at the World Peace Conference in 1919. And the Zionists got everything they wanted, including Woodrow Wilson, who was a very ardent Zionist himself. So he put Brandeis, who was the head of the World Zionist Organization, which was a very powerful position, he put him on the Supreme Court of the United States. And that's when Wilson put Brandeis on the Supreme Court. That is when the Supreme Court became the operating instrument of the world conspiracy right there. And it's been that ever since. And that's why they voted to put George Bush in the presidency, because they'll do anything that they're told to do.
Could George Bush be indicted for war crimes?
It's more or less disinformation. There is no indictment. There's no indictment going to be handed down. And all of these things are simply making George Bush more secure in office. He's almost ready to become president for life because there's no opposition whatsoever. The Democrats have been totally shattered. They have not a single candidate, and I don't know what they're going to do. And the Republicans don't even have a candidate. They're talking about McCain, who's the biggest phony in the United States. He's married to a mafia princess in Arizona, and he's rolling in money, and he has all the prestige in the world, and he has 100% media cooperation. You would think he's Frank Sinatra, because the media swoons every time McCain appears anywhere.
Could Zionists make George Bush a so-called leader for life?
Well, I think it could happen very easily, because we've elected puppets ever since 1900, when the bankers really took control. Well, he's got advisors who could change that very easily and then could know exactly how to do it. There's certainly certain regulations you'd have to follow, and you can make him president for life. Don't forget, Napoleon made himself emperor for life. Napoleon was a complete nobody. You got to remember that the American people are drinking fluoridated water every day, so they can't object to anything. So easy to do, because 9/11 was a step in the right direction, and they can repeat 9/11 at any time, like the Murray Building bombing in Oklahoma City, and the Waco Holocaust of burning a church, an entire church congregation alive in their own church, which Hitler never did in his worst years, but we welcomed it in this country. The CIA will support any dissident group, no matter how far out you are. If I had started a religious group or a political group at any time during the last 50 years of my career, I would have immediately gotten CIA support.
What do you mean support?
Financial support and political support. You'd be allowed to operate. And the FBI would not come in and shut you down tomorrow morning, because that is only done by orders from Washington. Well, they like to have fringe groups all over the country of any persuasion. They really don't care what you believe or what you do, as long as you do something. They're used to manipulate the population, because some people are going to be very enthusiastic about whatever goofy thing these people espouse, and other people are going to be fiercely opposed to it. So right away you've got opposition and conflict right away, which is just handed to you on a silver platter. You don't have to do anything. All you do is turn these people loose and have them attack each other, and you got a war on your hands.
Do you think the Zionists are planning a war in the United States?
Oh, yes. Well, what I think that they're having problems right now, because the fluoridation of the water and the medical establishment has made the children in schools so passive, and the working people so passive, that they don't object to anything. They didn't even, there was no opposition at all to going to war in Iraq, which was the flimsiest thing we've ever done in the history of this country, because Saddam Hussein had never fired a shot in this country, and he had never posed any threat to the United States of America. There was not one American in the United States who was afraid of Saddam Hussein. And our army goes marching into Iraq and pulls down his statues and throws him into prison. And they have a problem with trying him, which is that he had been a loyal asset of the CIA for 40 years. And it's hard to get rid of one of your most faithful officials over a number of years. He didn't just appear on the scene 2 years ago. He's got a 40-year history with the CIA, which most of the employees don't even have.
I mean, what's it all about?
Well, all of the foreign policy organizations in the world, at the end of World War I, the Rothschilds organized a number of groups called, one was the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. It's called Chatham House, and that is the think tank of all of Europe today. And although its headquarters in London, the real headquarters are in Brussels, which is the headquarters of the Lambert family, which is part of the Rothschild family. And Brussels has been running the world since, we had an ambassador to NATO for many years, because NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was headquartered in Brussels. And of course, there was no coincidence that it was headquartered in Brussels, the headquarters of the Lambert family, which is part of the Rothschild family. It was simply a family company.
Who do international bankers support for their control?
NATO and the Council on Foreign Relations and the Royal Institute of International Affairs are all very heavily financed, and if you become affiliated with them in some minor capacity, you'll have an annual salary of, say, $100,000, unlimited expense account to travel around the world on missions and stay at the most expensive hotels, and charge accounts at the most expensive shops to buy your clothes and so forth. And in other words, you become part of the international elite, and you live like a millionaire. Whether you have a dime of your own or not, it doesn't matter. And they will pay all these expenses until you make one mistake. If you give one wrong interview or say the wrong thing publicly, why, your history, that's your last day. And no one will ever hear of you again. And that happens quite frequently.
What do the corporate bankers have to hide?
What they've got to hide is their affiliation and control of all these foreign policy organizations. See, we have the Foreign Policy Institute and Foreign Affairs, the think tank magazine of the World Policy Organization, and all these are very expensive operations. And so they're all run by very trusted and faithful employees, and they do their job every day. They're at the office every day. They don't run out on you, they don't rat on you, or anything. They're dependable. And they have that job for as long as they live, and they know that. So they do their jobs, and they do whatever they're told. And it doesn't matter how goofy it is. You can do something as goofy as invading Iraq on the basis of information about WMDs that do not exist, weapons of mass destruction, and get away with it, because these people are accustomed to doing really goofy things that nobody in their right mind would believe in 1 minute. And they're very serious about it, and they have the background. They are people like President of Harvard University or President of Yale University, or they use a lot of corporate presidents, like the Aluminum Company of America president, and people like that, General Motors president, who have stature, and they can do or say anything, and nobody challenges them whatsoever. And that's what reputations are for. They're for people they can use. For instance, I've been a world-known author for 50 years, and yet my name is almost completely unknown, except it's all over the internet, because on the internet they have no control. But in the world media, on television, you'll never see me on television, because I've told people repeatedly that when you see anybody's face appear on your television, that means that that person is totally safe and totally owned by the establishment.
Does Israel control the foreign policy of the United States?
Israel completely controls the United States. In fact, Ariel Sharon, the president of Israel, has said that repeatedly publicly. It's very seldom picked up by the press. But he says the United States will do anything we tell them to. Not ask them to, but tell them to. When Zionism was first proposed in the early 1920s, you see, during World War I, they got the Balfour Declaration for a national home for Israel, and that was pushed through the British Parliament by Lord Rothschild. And because it was such a raw deal, because nobody in the world wanted a national home for the Jews, particularly the Jews, because they lived very well as a parasitic people all over the world, and they didn't particularly look forward to the idea of being confined to one country, which of course they never have done. And so most of your prominent Jews, including Jacob Schiff of Kuhn Loeb Company, who bankrolled the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, Jacob Schiff from 1920 to 1926 was an outspoken anti-Zionist. He believed that it would be suicidal for the Jewish people to have a national home, which of course they would have to be loyal to, as opposed to the freedom that they enjoyed, which was to be a citizen of every nation in the world, which was ideal for what they wanted to do.
Can Zionists destroy the world?
The Zionists have brought the world to the brink of total destruction, economic and natural resources and everything else. You see the skyrocketing price of oil and the skyrocketing price of real estate in the United States. This is a activity which can't go on at this pace long in a few weeks more, and everything's going to totally collapse. So wiser heads, of which are very few, realize that you can't keep going like this. But the bankers and the people who are making the money wanted to keep going like this, because when you're making trillions of dollars, you don't want to quit. It's an addiction. And so they'll keep letting this go on a few more months and see what turns up. There is a revolution going on in the world today, which is actually the world turning. As the world turns, it goes to a certain phase and another phase and another phase. And that's where we are now. Everything is changing, but we can't see it because it's not a day-to-day change. But there is, well, the internet was one example, because under the internet, people like myself, which have all media totally closed, television, newspapers, and yet I've become a internationally known writer just by doing it myself. It can be done. So things are not static. Things are less static than they've ever been. And I look for, right now, you see you have a new generation coming up every 20 years. And that new generation wants to make itself felt. They want to make its presence known. And so every 20 years you're facing an utter revolution, because the 20-year generation, many of them from wealthy families, are from prominent families, and have some stature in themselves, and many others are totally penniless and have no background whatsoever. But they create a place for themselves. I started my own publishing company because they told me on Wall Street that they couldn't print my book because the banks would close them down on Monday morning. So I found a child psychologist who would publish my Federal Reserve book. So it can be done. And the publishing media and communications are advancing at a very breathless rate. So you don't know what they're coming up with in the next 6 months. Don't forget they put a bill through Congress to control the internet, and it was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, because it was totally unconstitutional. There was no justification for it forever. The Supreme Court represents the occupation government, because the government is always an occupation government, representing somebody else. The government does not represent the American people, because the democracy is supposed to be representative government. Now, Washington today does not represent any American, except in a very tenuous way.
Was 9/11 an inside job?
100%. What I called it publicly, I was quoted in the New York Times after 9/11, I said it's a typical government operation. And I don't know anybody that said it better. And that appeared in the New York Times in the Frank Rich column, and Frank Rich printed it, but he didn't offer any rebuttal.
Is it a United States government job, or is it a Zionist inside job?
Well, it's more a Zionist inside job,
Okay.
because the Zionism is the government in Washington. Everybody knows that.
So the United States government is controlled by Zionists.
Yes. Well, in Congress, have you ever heard any congressman stand up and make a speech denouncing Israel. Well, you won't.
With that said, and these bankers know that, you know, their time can be limited, no
Yeah.
matter how much money they got, what would they be capable of doing?
Well, right now they're capable of staying on top of the current, and they have enough money to buy into anything they want to. So they're trying to keep control. But of course, they have no control over the internet. Anything can come on the internet. And so they're just trying to ride it out.